Hey everyone, welcome to Legalbytes. My name's Alyte, and on this channel, we explain the law one bite at a time. Okay, you know what? This is a terrible idea. We just rewatched Ready Player One. It's a really fun movie with a lot of interesting themes to pick apart, especially for a lawyer. One of the things that it seems to suggest is that microtransactions can somehow lead to involuntary servitude, which admittedly is a little bit ridiculous. But it got me thinking, what would it take for microtransactions to lead to involuntary servitude? It is a crazy question, but also an interesting thought experiment. So come join us. Today we'll talk about whether microtransactions could hypothetically lead to involuntary servitude. Coming up on Legalbytes. Okay, so before we get into Ready Player One, I first have to give a massive thanks to GameRanks and to Jake Baldino for sending all of their fans over to our channel last week to watch our video on The People versus Joel, all about the game The Last of Us and The Last of Us Part 2, where I defended Joel to see if he was entitled to any sort of a self-defense argument in the game. So the morning we published the video, I tagged Jake and GameRanks in some of our social media posts, and I had absolutely no expectation that they would do anything about it. And the amount of responses that we got was amazing. It was so much more than anything our channel had seen so far, and we are so incredibly grateful. And with that, we want to continue making content that you guys will enjoy that's centered around pop culture and law and society. So I'm so excited to continue doing that and to try to find new and diverse ways to do that. But one thing I can promise you is that we will always strive to bring the best content to you guys that we possibly can and to always try to work to improve. Okay, on to Ready Player One. Last weekend, my husband and I rewatched it again, and watching it with my lawyer goggles on, some things popped out at me that I thought would be maybe interesting to discuss. Initially, I thought maybe I would talk about an estate planning element that shows up in the movie, but then another issue kind of caught my eye, and it sent me down this rabbit hole of research, not just into law, but also into the gaming industry itself. Specifically, what jumped out at me was the existence of involuntary servitude in the movie, in the form of loyalty centers. Loyalty centers are areas that people get locked up into when they can't pay off their debts. Those debts are accumulated through microtransactions. I'll get more into both later in the video, but basically microtransactions are in-game purchases placed in games by developers as a strategy for making money for games that are otherwise usually cheap or free to play. Not all games have them, but there's a growing trend to include them because they are a substantial source of revenue. The way it plays out is usually this. In order to access a certain part of the game or to obtain some upgrades to make your character more competitive in a game, you either need to pay real-life money in order to access that, or you need to play a certain amount in order to circumvent the payment process. The amount of time necessary to unlock a feature through gameplay is usually an astounding amount of time. It's intended to influence gamers just to pay money so that they can move forward with their gameplay. One result of this is that gamers can end up paying more for a game that's otherwise a cheap game than they would for one that is maybe more expensive from the outset, but is a one-time purchase. Researching into microtransactions, it kind of reminds me of the awful experience of flying on Spirit Airlines. I remember buying a ticket once thinking that it was a great deal, and I did not realize just how much I would be paying, not only in checked baggage fees, but also in carry-on fees. And then the actual experience itself was not great because there was no in-flight service, the seat didn't recline, and I was on a red eye. So then when I landed in my destination, exhausted and totally uncomfortable, and I calculated all of the fees and realized that I ended up spending more on this flight than I would have on another flight that was much more comfortable and wouldn't have nickel and dimed me along the way, I was livid.
Are you out of your mind?
Sorry, I get a little bit riled up about Spirit Airlines, so I can understand why gamers also get riled up about microtransactions. Microtransactions are highly controversial, especially among gamers, for all kinds of reasons. There are different kinds of microtransactions, but it seems like the one that is the most outrageous is the loot box. With loot boxes, you essentially pay for an assortment of randomized items in order to unlock a certain feature, without any sort of guarantee that that assortment will have anything of value to you. Criticisms of microtransactions range all the way from the fact that they cheapen the game, they interrupt gameplay, and then all the way on the other side to the fact that they potentially exploit minors and people with gaming addictions. A number of countries have placed regulations on microtransactions. This is largely out of a concern that microtransactions are very close to gambling and that they otherwise lead to irresponsible financial behavior by people that are more vulnerable to that sort of situation. In the United States, a bill was introduced in the Senate in May 2019 by Republican Senator Josh Hawley of Missouri. The bill was specifically targeted at curbing certain microtransactions in video games, especially where those games are played by children. The bill has apparently lost its momentum, but it shows that there is a growing concern over the consequences of microtransactions. But could microtransactions really lead to involuntary servitude? To give you a brief roadmap, I'll start by giving a quick summary of the film, and then I'll get into some of the legal reasons why microtransactions would not necessarily lead to involuntary servitude in our current legal framework. And then we'll get into some more hypothetical situations to see what would need to change in order to develop into a society that would have that, and then some things that might prevent it. Parts of this analysis will be legal and parts of it will be a little bit more sociological, so let us know what you think in the comments. Okay, so I know that the movie came out over 2 years ago now, but there could always be someone who has been living under a rock and who wants a chance to pause the video so that they can go and watch the movie first. So I'm going to give an opportunity for people to do that if they want to, and otherwise for everyone else I'm going to give 10 seconds of kitten footage. Also because that was really popular last time. Okay, starting now. So for everyone that's still here, if you're not familiar with Ready Player One, it's a film that came out in 2018 and is based on a 2011 novel written by Ernest Cline. There are some differences between the movie and the book that I found kind of interesting, so I'll bring those in too in a few parts. In the movie, the story takes place in a dystopian version of Columbus, Ohio in 2045. It follows the journey of Wade Watts, a 17 or 18-year-old orphan living with his aunt in an area called the Stacks. The world in 2045 is in total disarray. Environmental crises, food shortages, disease, and other large-scale problems have taken over and have grown so big that people have just stopped trying to solve their problems. Instead, they're escaping to a virtual world called the Oasis, the most immersive virtual experience the world has ever seen. It's filled to the brim with pop culture references from the 1970s and 1980s. The Oasis is the brainchild of James Halliday, who built it with his friend Ogden Morrow. Together, they created Gregarious Games, which operates the Oasis. Anyone can join and log into the Oasis. Its main attraction is that, well, there's nowhere else to go. It's both the largest massively multiplayer online role-playing game, or MMORPG, and at the same time, the largest social network, pretty much on steroids. People join as avatars and can modify their appearance and gear in pretty much any way they want. They can take vacations at exotic virtual tropical worlds. They can ski down the pyramids, climb mountains with Batman, and go to casinos for all kinds of activities. Anyway, as Wade says, people come for what they can do. They stay because of what they can be. Everyone is on the Oasis, and it's become a crucial part of their everyday lives. Wade himself chooses an avatar that goes by the name Parzival. In the book version, Wade goes to school in the Oasis because it's more accessible to him than public or private schools. He also at one point takes on a job at the Oasis. It's also the place where Wade meets all of his best friends, H, Sho, Daito, and Artemis, who's also kind of his sort of girlfriend. But although it's far better than the outside world, it's also far from perfect. In order to customize and upgrade your avatar, you have to engage in microtransactions. Given the way in which people's everyday lives are so intertwined with the Oasis, people start going there for opportunity to better their economic situations, but with a high risk. It's not uncommon for people to lose everything, and in fact, people often amass huge amounts of debt. When they can't pay that debt, they get thrown into an IOI loyalty center, where they're forced to work for IOI to repay their debts. IOI, which stands for Innovative Online Industries, is led by the top bad guy in the story, Nolan Sorrento. In the movie version, IOI is a virtual reality equipment manufacturer. In the book version, however, IOI is a media conglomerate that started as an internet provider that over time gobbled up other companies and became an incredibly powerful information corporation. IOI's goal in obtaining the Oasis is to increase advertising to a ridiculous scale and to keep the profits. At the very beginning of the movie, James Halliday, the co-creator and only remaining owner of the Oasis, dies. He leaves behind no spouse and no children, so in his will he leaves his total control of the Oasis and his $500 billion fortune to the person who finds an Easter egg hidden in the Oasis. In order to find it, people have to first find and obtain 3 keys. To get the keys, players have to overcome challenges that can only be achieved by answering clues having to do with 1980s pop culture and the inner mind of James Halliday. Parzival and his friends work their way through the clues, catching the attention of Sorrento and IOI. As a result, they have to not only be the first to the keys in each round, but also successfully avoid getting attacked by IOI's people, both in the Oasis and in the real world.
This isn't a game, Z. I'm doing this to stop IOI. I'm talking about real-world consequences. People suffering. Actual life and death stuff.
I know.
No, you don't know. My dad died in a loyalty center. He borrowed gear. He built up debt. He moved in with the promise of working it out, but he never did. IOI just raised his living expenses, then he got sick and he couldn't afford to get out, and then he died!
Realistically, in our current legal system, the idea that microtransactions can lead to what Artemis's dad went through is actually pretty highly unlikely. First, the United States, like many countries around the world, has a legal code and a court system specifically dedicated to bankruptcy. In the United States, if a person or a business amasses so much debt that they can't possibly pay it off, what they do is they file for bankruptcy. Second, what Artemis's father went through was actually involuntary servitude, which is of course prohibited by the 13th Amendment of the United States Constitution, as well as a bunch of legislation that was passed by Congress in order to tackle human trafficking both in the United States and around the world. In the United States, the Victims of Trafficking and Violence Protection Act, or VTVPA, of 2000 aims to combat human trafficking, especially in the sex trade and involuntary servitude. And over the years, a number of amendments have been passed in order to strengthen those laws and to give government agencies the ability to enforce those laws even better. The Trade Facilitation and Trade Enforcement Act of 2015 placed a burden on importers and multinational companies to ensure that their products aren't stained with human rights violations. And many have begun implementing anti-trafficking programs like internal training for employees, risk-based assessment of suppliers, and programs to help victims leave abusive environments. The problem still exists, and some would say that companies still probably need to do more in order to help combat human trafficking. Still, it's a very different situation than Ready Player One. In Ready Player One, IOI has an entire department dedicated to openly arresting the poor and putting them to work in harsh labor conditions, sometimes killing the detainees in the process, like Artemis's dad. If some company tried to go that far in our current legal system, especially in a place like Ohio where all of this really takes place, 2 main things would happen. First, there would be public outrage and probably a lot of lawsuits for civil rights violations. And second, government agencies that are empowered by congressional legislation would probably get involved pretty quickly to prosecute individuals working at the company, as well as probably the company itself, in order to stem the human trafficking violations. Okay, so those are really big things that a company like IOI would need to overcome. So in order to get to this hypothetical world where microtransactions could lead to involuntary servitude, certain things would need to happen both on the big business side in Ready Player One, as well as the way in which microtransactions operate. On the business side, companies associated with the Oasis would need to become so powerful, 1, that they can lobby to have fundamental laws rewritten, 2, that government regulation becomes pretty much useless, and 3, that people can't effectively sue them for civil rights violations. Given the big global problems that Wade talks about, like famine and disease, it's possible that those problems could lead to the government either having its hands tied with the other issues or lead to some kind of grand-scale social collapse that affects the character, enforcement, and litigation of our laws. But aside from that, in order for IOI to get so powerful that the government basically becomes useless against them, they would need to have 3 things: size, scarcity, and necessity. In order to get away with human rights violations, IOI would really need to be very big. One of the greatest criticisms coming out of the Great Recession was that big corporations received huge bailouts from the federal government, while smaller businesses and individuals really didn't receive much financial help at all and ended up folding or having to file for bankruptcy. So in a situation like Ready Player One, in order for the federal government to ignore massive human rights violations that are blatantly done out in the open by some corporation, there would need to be some reason for the government to ignore it that serves the government's overall interests. In a dystopian world like what Wade described, it could very well be that the government is just barely holding things together and is really dependent on big corporations like gregarious games and like IOI. Scarcity would be important because IOI would need for consumers to not have any other options to choose from in the marketplace between their company and other companies. In Ready Player One, Wade says the Oasis is literally the only way to escape reality. For that to happen, companies would need to be able to provide access to the Oasis without competition, either because 1, other companies simply don't exist, or 2, because they somehow have exclusivity to the Oasis. An example of exclusivity in a much smaller, but albeit enraging way, is how many gamers feel forced to deal with microtransactions if they want to be a part of a specific gaming community. If you want to play a game having to do with Star Wars, only one company has been licensed by Disney to manage the franchise. The same thing is true of any game having to do with FIFA, the NBA, the NFL, etc., etc. All of those franchises, including Star Wars, are licensed by EA, which is the company that has drawn probably the most ire for its use of microtransactions. In Ready Player One, the Oasis is not just some really big immersive video game. It's both the largest MMORPG and the largest social media platform that the world has ever seen. Both of these function by providing a space for a large number of people interacting at the same time. So the entertainment value of both of them actually depends quite a bit on the number of people that are on it. So if you have on the one hand the world's largest MMORPG and at the same time the largest social media network smashed together into one community space, this becomes a place that people really rely on in order for connection with society. If you couple that with the fact that people can go to school and work in the Oasis, you also have economic necessity tied in there as well. And by the way, the work and school aspect is actually not that far off. In light of the COVID-19 pandemic, a lot of companies are starting to announce that they're going to start putting a significant portion of their employees in a work-from-home scenario, probably forever. And Facebook, in an effort to improve the experience for their employees, is reportedly working on a way to develop virtual reality or augmented reality technology specifically for that purpose. So we may see growing numbers of people beginning to go to work and school in a virtual space. Okay, so to talk about how the microtransaction side would need to happen, we're going to talk about some stuff that's a little bit less legal and a little bit more sociological. When a community starts to develop, people start to differentiate themselves from the masses in various ways. In the Oasis, people are often buying or playing for precious artifacts. In order to win those artifacts, people need to upgrade their stuff, which can only really be done through microtransactions. Again, either by buying the stuff or playing for a lot of hours in order to achieve this stuff. Because of that, a player's upgrades start to become a signal to other people around them about their status. The more upgraded your Oasis avatar is, the more likely you are to either have a lot of wealth or have a lot of gaming skill. And if gaming skill can also bring wealth in the Oasis, then having an upgraded avatar can really have double the social power. This can lead to people buying upgraded gear, not necessarily to actually pursue those artifacts, but just to look like someone who has the skill to do it. When a person buys things just for their social status, that's called conspicuous consumption. In our world, that usually is when a person buys a lot of brand name luxury items or goes on lavish vacations only to post them on social media. It's a trend that sociologists trace back to at least the late 1800s as individuals or groups pull themselves out of poverty and so want to differentiate themselves from the groups that they are sort of leaving behind. In today's world of MMORPG games, this is creating peer pressure, particularly among kids. In Fortnite, avatars start off with a default skin, meaning he or she hasn't spent any money on cosmetic upgrades or hasn't been playing long enough to earn them. It's been reported that when a kid's avatar has a default skin, other kids playing online with them have started bullying kids for either not being wealthy enough or skilled enough in the game. Either way, it's pressuring kids to beg their parents to buy them these upgrades. So if you expand the scope from a game like Fortnite into a platform that encompasses pretty much all of society, you're very likely going to get people that are engaging in all kinds of conspicuous consumption, which increases their debt potentially, which makes them ultimately more vulnerable to companies like IOI. So what are some things that could prevent a company like IOI from using microtransactions to put people into gulag-like labor camps? Basically, the way that I see it is it comes down to three main things: capitalism, democracy, and regulation. As I mentioned before, there are regulations in place that would prevent a company like IOI from engaging in blatant human trafficking. On top of that, there are also laws that regulate competition between businesses, notably the Sherman Antitrust Act. In all likelihood, it would be really difficult for a business like IOI to become that big in the face of those possible restrictions. Related to that, if the government doesn't regulate something that the masses say that needs to be regulated, democracy is a pretty good way of replacing those representatives with other people who would. And on the microtransaction side, efforts can be made to prevent further exploitation of people, either by government regulation or by internal regulation within the industry. There are costs and benefits to either one, and given the length of this video, I think I'll leave that to another time. Finally, another factor that can intervene is the existence of competition in the market. So long as consumers have some level of choice, there's always a possibility that a company can lose their customers, and that's one reason to keep them happy. Or if they're not exactly keeping them happy, at least not engaging in IOI level stuff. Okay, so that journey was admittedly a little bit nuts, but what do you guys think? Could microtransactions ever lead to involuntary servitude? Is there some information that I was missing from my analysis that should have been included? Let us know in the comments. Also, we loved getting ideas from you guys last week for future videos, so please keep them coming. We're trying new things on this channel, and we are definitely open for feedback from you guys. And I am always trying to learn more about gaming and pop culture, especially where they intersect with law and society. So if you guys ever come across any kind of information that you think we might be interested in, please go ahead and send it to us. We are on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. And finally, if you guys enjoyed this video, please hit the like button. And if you're new to our channel and you want to see more from us, hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. That way you can find out when the next video is coming. Thanks!